Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Magnetic Masculinity Podcast, where we provide men with practical tools and strategies to bridge the gap between achievement and fulfillment so that they can live their most magnetic lives. Today, we're going into the next piece of vehicle of consciousness, which is battery or heart. And can we maybe start with explaining what's the difference between heart and the software or brain that we talked about last time, and how does it even like how did you come with an idea that heart is the battery? What's the connection there?
Okay, well, nice to see everyone again. So for anybody who's tuning in who is not aware what we're talking about in the vehicle of consciousness, this is one of the metaphors that I use to help you quickly diagnose and repair when something in your life is not working so that you can optimize your life experience. And it's part of what I call the magnetic masculinity blueprint. So in that metaphor I created, your heart is the battery. And the reason and again, there's different ways we could look at it. There's different metaphors that are valid that we could use, but it just helps us gain that metaphorical alignment so that we can, again, deliver information in a more effective way, helping the brain understand it by using things it already knows. So again, your brain is the supercomputer, your body is the engine. It needs a full tank of gas, proper maintenance, checkups, and proper fluids. Emotions are your navigation system, and all of those systems are important, but so is the battery, at least in a car that is operated with the help of a battery or entirely on a battery, either or. And your heart is that battery. So it is what will really energize or drain us. Now, it's not an or, it's an and. So, and the engine needs to have a full tank of gas. So if we're eating lousy, if we have all of our love needs met and we're feeling super connected to ourselves and others and source consciousness or God or the universe or whatever you prefer, but we're eating terribly and we have no energy and we're only sleeping 2 hours a night, you're not going to have energy. So we want all the systems to be optimized ideally. But without that heart battery, none of it feels fun. And it's more like you're forcing energy, or like you've got maybe energy, but it doesn't feel fun. So there is different types of what we're calling energy, and we ourselves are made out of energy, we know. So it's more looking at, as energetic beings, what different systems need to work together. What can we optimize? What practical steps can we take so that we feel inspired and we feel energized and in flow state and connected and all of the wonderful things that we can feel when men are in that magnetic masculinity or enlightenment or their full potential or whatever, their most fulfilling life, living their best life, whichever metaphor you prefer.
And with the heart, what is it that it contains of, or what are some of the important pieces that are, let's say some men listening there, like what do you mean by heart? Like what is it consisting of?
Okay, well, we have our physical heart, which of course is an area that that can be very susceptible to things in the engine, not suboptimal food going in or whatever. But what I'm speaking about is we also have brain cells in our heart. We used to think, when I went to school, we learned that all your brain cells were in your head. We now know that actually we could almost look at our entire vehicle of consciousness as one giant brain made up of different systems, or in this case, I'm using the vehicle of consciousness for you to experience your divine spiritual soul in a human body. But your heart is what helps you connect to yourself, to others, and to your intuition or the divine or God or source or unity consciousness, whichever metaphor you prefer again. So we know now that we have brain cells in our heart. We know that we have brain cells in our gut. So again, we could almost look at the heart as an extension of the brain, but for this case, we're just looking at it to simplify it as a battery, and we want to charge it. So if we are living in the emotional dark ages, which we are, and men have been forced to sort of not get their emotional needs met because they've been taught things like suck it up, toughen up, you have to do this, you have to be this, don't cry, don't be a sissy, don't be a whatever. And they don't know that they deserve to get emotional needs met, like being admired, being adored, being appreciated, being held, being, words of affirmation, whatever their love language is. And they don't know that they're worthy of receiving that, or they don't have a way to get that need met. And they don't have a way to connect with themselves and others. That battery gets shut down. And there are obviously physical symptoms or physical things like eating too much cholesterol or whatever things can, eating bacon 3 times a day or whatever. There are things that can physically impact your health, but we're multidimensional beings. So there are things that are also energetically or emotionally can shut that heart down. And opening that up and charging that battery can be very uncomfortable for men or unfamiliar. But when we do, you connect to your intuition. You could almost think of it like, not only is your heart the battery, but it's also how you connect to the World Wide Web or the internet. Your intuition, your higher knowledge, your higher wisdom is all through the heart. And a lot of us have living in the emotional dark ages have had our hearts really wounded. And we've had a lot of betrayal and abandonment and childhood trauma and separation and judgment and shame and guilt and suppressed anger and suppressed sadness. And this causes the heart to sort of protect itself or create a sheet of some armor. But then we can't energize it because it gets energized. How we charge that battery is by charging it in the World Wide Web, connecting to everything, connecting to ourselves, connecting to our others at a deep soul level, at a loving, connected, open, vulnerable level. Vulnerability is part of the heart too. And that is something that men are not taught. And in fact, they're almost forced to experience the opposite of, which makes it harder for them to connect in relationships, which means that the women feel less seen and heard, and their emotional needs aren't being met, and their heart shuts down, and their behavior gets suboptimal, and then the men shut down more. And again, I'm generalizing, and I recognize that there are lots of people on different areas of a gender spectrum, and all of that is valid. I'm just using stereotypes because it's helpful for metaphorical alignment. So the heart can be a tricky one, but it's very, very important that we have that battery charged. And again, when that battery is charged and all of the systems are running effectively, you are in charge. It's not as much about control, but it's more like empowerment and flow state and clarity and confidence and emotional mastery and delicious relationships and more time in flow state. And that requires being able to charge that battery.
And because you mentioned that heart shuts down, do you have some either practical example or something that can help men identify whether their heart has shut down? How does it look like? How does it feel like? What's the experience?
Well, everybody experiences things differently. So, and there might be other ways that people could say that might be more effective than the ways I'm going to say. So this is not the absolute answer. It's only my experience and my subjective perspective. But numbness, so just like disconnecting, numbness, feeling disconnected, feeling flat and depressed, although there can be other reasons for feeling that as well. It's not only the heart, but that can be one way. There are other reasons that we could feel that, like low serotonin in your gut or disconnection from others or a chemical reaction in your brain. Like there are other reasons that we could feel that, but those are some. Just sort of like something is missing, but they don't know what it is. I guess another way to look at it is, what does it feel when the heart is open? When the heart is open, we feel connected. We feel vulnerable. A lot of men I will ask them, and not all men have children. I don't have children, so whether you choose to have children or not is fine. But a lot of men, I say, how do you feel when you look at your child? That's how you know when your heart is open. Or how do you feel when you're with your dog? And that's sort of like that heart opening, and that's why they want to spend all their time with that one particular thing, right? Because they feel open and vulnerable. They feel safe to be vulnerable in front of a child because they don't have to put their parts. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, parts, please refer back to our episode on parts work and our multidimensional aspects of our personality. But, you know, in your marriage or in your work environment, your protector personalities have their dukes up, they have their fists up, they've got their shield of armor on. But occasionally that armor will crack when you're looking at your child, or your child says, "Daddy, I love you." Or, you know, on your wedding day, or when you're out sitting with your dog and your dog is looking up at you adoringly, or, you know, everybody can think of a time, or your mother was comforting you in childhood. You know, somebody can find, it might be helpful for men to just find a time in their life where they physically felt that heart like opening, that heart throbbing, that like, and it's so vulnerable and so open. But then again, our protector personalities are like, wait, shut this down, stop, protect it. And there might be a lot of wounds and scars or trauma because, you know, we're understanding more and more in society about trauma, and understanding that we don't get to choose what our brain sorts as trauma. Some men that I work with have had trauma from circumcision, or trauma from being told to suck it up one time in childhood, or being told they're stupid on the playground, or have trauma from hazing in their fraternity, or, you know, so, and just the collective epigenetic trauma that we're experiencing as a species, or that we're healing from and becoming aware of as we evolve out of the emotional dark ages. So, you know, we have those wounding, those sort of scars on the heart, and I think we learn to protect those with this shell. So one way to learn whether your heart is shut down is try to find a way, try to find that one time in your life when you're like, you felt that swelling, that knowing, that connection, that flood of endorphins in your body, that oxytocin, and that safety. So the heart, there's a lot of, now if people spoke in the metaphors of chakras, people would say a lot of your safety is in your root chakra, your core, your grounding, your financial stability, and safety is very, very, very important. Us feeling safe is very important, but the heart often doesn't feel safe to open up and get that battery charged.
What is it that is playing a role in that safety of opening up and being in a place of like charging it?
Well, if we don't feel safe to be open, and we don't feel safe to be vulnerable, or it feels unfamiliar, then our protector personalities are going to try to stop us from doing it. Or that just that feeling of discomfort and vulnerability to men can really feel very scary and overwhelming. And it's a skill. It requires some skill, and it requires a safe environment, because a lot of men do open up and they sort of get attacked. Or, you know, it's like they're like, okay, I'm going to let this shell down, and they open up and their wife, you know, says something, or their partner says something, and that shield goes back up. So one of the things I like to do is create a safe container for men to practice that openness and that vulnerability, so that they can start to create a more secure attachment, or understand what that feels like if we were to go into attachment theory, which we don't have to today, but learning some of those, it's something if men can learn about if they want to. We'll do that in our episode of relationships, is that secure attachment, that safety, right? If that vehicle doesn't feel safe, if any one of those systems is malfunctioning, it impacts all the other systems. And we talked in, I believe, 2 episodes ago about our wants, needs, boundaries, and values. One of the needs of every human being on this planet is to feel safe. And if you don't feel safe to open up, or you open up and you get attacked, or you've had your heart broken by a relationship, or you've had your heart broken by a friend, you know, then we want to heal those wounds and create that sense of security and safety to sort of open that heart back up so that we can charge that battery by connecting to others, connecting to God or source, connecting to ourselves, connecting to our own parts, the parts of us that we've judged, the parts of us that we have shamed, the parts of us that we have banished, like which we talk about in our episode. What was that episode called? Called Parts Work, I believe we called it.
Yeah,
So
they're built
people
to
can,
as well.
if you're not sure what I'm referring to, please go back and listen to past episodes. So, and it does take a lot of bravery. A lot of men are taught that it's weak or that they're going to be too sensitive. We also have an episode about all of the emotional objections that men have to opening up and feeling their emotions. Some of those might also relate to the heart battery. So that could also be a helpful resource to help you understand and feel safe by handling all of those objections, which is why we did that episode of just here's all the objections that men give me about wanting to feel emotions. And the emotional navigation system and the heart battery are very, like any system in a car, they're very closely related.
And speaking on
and they are with the computer and the brain too. Like if the brain has a program of people are not safe, or I am not safe, or nice guys always finish last, or whatever, then that brain is going to influence the heart as well, right? That software is going to constantly reinforce the heart. Nope, shut down. Nope, shut down. Nope, shut down. So again, that's why I like to look at things from this multidimensional aspect or multidimensional approach, so that we can optimize each one of the systems independently, so that we can have our vehicle of consciousness running at full efficacy.
and so speaking on charging the battery, what are some of the tools or strategies or some ways that men can charge their battery?
Okay, so first, again, we have to be able to open the heart a bit, and different things work for different people. So again, I'll just offer some suggestions. Connecting compassion to ourselves. So that's why we always have that layer of self-compassion that we did an episode on. That self-compassion is very important, because if we have a base foundation of self-compassion, we're less likely to shame collapse, and we're more likely to be able to show up with other people and with ourselves with curiosity and compassion, rather than blind spots, shame collapsing, judgment, separation. So that self-compassion can help charge the battery, or at least and help us open the battery, start opening the battery. Self-compassion is always really important. We can charge the battery by acts of service to others. Like you can think of, sometimes you feel really good when you give to others, by connecting with a loved one in a healthy way, by getting our needs met, feeling heard, feeling seen, having a fun, healthy emotional connection with a friend or relative or lover or partner. You could charge that battery by even, like, say you love nature and you go out into nature and you're like, oh, look at all these trees, look at this top of this mountain, I'm so proud of myself. So there's, different things charge the heart battery for different people. Volunteering at your church group, or helping somebody experiencing homelessness, or donating money, or speaking kind words to other people, making other people feel good, can charge your heart battery. You're standing in a line and a cashier is having a busy day and people are yelling at her and she's flustered. You can say, hey, I think you're doing a really good job today. Because we are actually a very interdependent species and we're all connected to this World Wide Web. So we have to work on how we speak to ourselves and how we feel ourselves, and understanding our emotional navigation system, but then understanding how consciousness works and the illusion of separation, and understanding that how we make other people feel can also charge our battery. And spreading kindness and spreading love and spreading appreciation and meeting other people's needs can actually meet our own needs too, because everybody is a part of us. But often I say, start with the self, start with compassion, and start with your dog or your child or whatever it is that fills that heart battery and fills that connection to yourself, to others, and to source, or the universe, or God, or the unified field, if you prefer science metaphors.
So with these, I'm just thinking even like with men, they don't only have expectation of themselves to a lot of times to be strong and tough, which is kind of like contradicting the idea of being compassionate and kind, but it's also expectations of society and people around them. Like, what are some of the, even like some of the challenges that you have seen men go through, and how can they navigate them? Because it's, in a way, it's kind of, it can be benefit them, and some of them might be listening and that's something they want, but in their mind they'd be like that, but people expect me to be this way, or I have been raised to be this way. How can they navigate
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, well, that's valid. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are at this big evolutionary shift in humanity. So anybody that's listening to this podcast is an early evolver, is an evolutionary leader. And I'm not going to say that you are in a safe environment to be completely open and vulnerable all the time, because that would be gaslighting. We're not necessarily there yet. So I have clients who are, in very harsh work environments. I have a client who's a homicide detective who has to deal, who has to kind of show up and and be able to sometimes temporarily defer some of those experiences to be processed later, but they have to be processed later. So you may, and I would also like to acknowledge that I have participated in not creating a safe space historically in relationships for men to have emotions. And this is something that a lot of my clients explain to me, that I can reflect and go, oh yeah, I've definitely done that in relationships. Whereas women, we expect men to be strong and tough and provide and take care of us and be the rock, but then we expect them to be vulnerable. But when they're vulnerable, we might fall apart, or we're like, what are you doing? We need you to be strong, because then the women feel unsafe. So it's more like men are like, okay, well, I don't know, there's not a blueprint. Like, when am I supposed to boss up, and when am I supposed to soften, and it can be very confusing. And they might be put in a position where other men will get triggered by that vulnerability or that connection. But I say do it anyways in some cases, because people will be activated. It will be unfamiliar. It won't be what they were taught. It won't be what you were taught. But I would propose that we are here to help shape the collective direction of humanity. And that's going to require being a little different. And I think that is brave, and that is tough, and that is strong, being willing to be that trailblazer, being willing to model a new reality to help the collective consciousness of humanity shift out of the emotional dark ages, I think is probably the strongest, bravest thing I can think of. But I do acknowledge that it can be challenging, it can be uncomfortable, and that it does require practicing in a somewhat safe environment, which is why I want to start shifting into this magnetic masculinity movement and create safe containers for men to learn these skills and explore and connect and communicate and practice the skills to work to experience really delicious relationships and find the inherent power that comes with vulnerability. Often that vulnerability, that softness, opening the heart, can be perceived as a weakness, but that is just a misperception. That is just a program. That is just part of that lousy software we talked about in our last episode on the computer. It's just lousy software. It's not who you are. It's not your fault, but it's not good. It's not optimal software. There is nothing more powerful than vulnerability. But being vulnerable in a society where we've had to fit in by shutting that down is a tricky position to navigate, and I acknowledge that.
I was wondering, as you were talking, can you explain a bit more, what does it look like or feel like to be vulnerable? In case if there's some men listening who, for them, it might be something either unfamiliar or they have heard about it, but what exactly is it?
It's a great question. So I've worked with some really incredible and what we would call powerful men who will shut down at the thought of being vulnerable, or they will be vulnerable with me, and I might be the first person they've ever been vulnerable with in their lives because they're afraid to show themselves, again, because we're trying to fit in, which we've done episodes about. So following these episodes of this podcast in order, we do have some sort of sense of why we do things in certain orders, which will improve over time, I'm sure. We're always constantly tweaking and trying to find more clarity on the magnetic masculinity blueprint. But cultivating that self-compassion is an important step before we're vulnerable, as well as developing our ability to eat a shit sandwich, or not shame collapse, but celebrate awareness of what we're not doing well, sort of creates a hospitable environment for vulnerability. And vulnerability and shame have a very interesting relationship, because shame cannot exist where there is openness, transparency, compassion, and vulnerability. Shame needs to hide in the shadows. So those can have a very interesting relationship with each other, but it's the shame or the fear of being judged that prevents us from being vulnerable, which actually makes the problem worse, because then we can't connect to others. And the reason we have that shame and fear of judgment is because we want to connect with others and we're afraid of them rejecting us. But then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that it's actually making it worse, because again, we're just now bravely evolving out of the emotional dark ages.
And following a bit along with vulnerability, what would you say or suggest to some men who have tried to be vulnerable, but it either didn't go well or it was even like in some ways painful experience? How can they recover from that and kind of still have hope into attempting to be vulnerable again?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And that's something I've experienced as well, where I'm quite naturally a very vulnerable person. I'm a bit of an open book, so I have been hurt a lot of times. But I'll tell you from my own experience that there is nothing more painful than the pain of separation and loneliness. So we can acknowledge our hurt, we can acknowledge our pain, and we can get a lot of clarity in our wants, needs, boundaries, and values and boundaries. And we can learn over time discernment of who to be vulnerable with. I would also like to acknowledge that I have participated poorly in not holding space when tried to be vulnerable with me in the past. And looking back and reflecting, I cringe and think like, oh, I wouldn't realize how hard that was for them to say something. And then I would just dismiss it, or I'd be like, oh, that's silly, or what are you talking about? Or just, yeah. So it definitely happens, that we can practice being vulnerable and it doesn't go well. But like anything, practice makes perfect. And I would propose that the pain of, well, I think that I might be wrong. I think that our perceived pain of rejection, or our perceived pain of hurt, wounding, trauma, abandonment, betrayal, that shuts that down. We perceive that to be the worst pain of all. But I think that the worst pain of all is self-abandonment, self-rejection, not being vulnerable with ourselves, and therefore not being vulnerable with others. Because again, love and belonging is the number one biological, neurological, scientifically inarguable, potentially, need of the human species. But again, we're confusing fitting in with love and belonging, but that love and belonging not only needs to exist within our own parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that we judge, the parts of ourselves, the inauthentic parts, that love and belonging needs to exist within our internal mechanism, our internal personality systems, as well as externally with those around us. So, does that answer your question?
And with that, because you mentioned something I was about to ask you about vulnerability with yourself, because that's something that I haven't really heard of or thought of. How does that look like, or how can men listening even practice it or look into it or do it?
Yeah. A lot of self-compassion, a lot of curiosity, and a lot of bravery. It involves looking at the parts of ourselves, being authentic with ourselves, being honest with ourselves, and holding space for uncomfortable emotions, and holding space and curiosity for things that are wounds, our traumas, without getting, completely identified with them and making it our new identity or becoming, but just sort of looking at things as information and curiosity within ourselves. Like, for instance, I had a lot of trouble being vulnerable to express anger or sadness. And now we'll get more into this in our emotional navigation system episode. But just to touch on it, if we don't become vulnerable and accepting and compassionate of all of our parts, especially the really rotten, underdeveloped, mischievous, silly, ridiculous parts of ourselves, then it's that own self-abandonment, that self-rejection, that self-judgment that's really excruciating. And often we develop like a vicious inner critic. And one of the positive intentions of our inner critic is to protect us from external rejection. But then what happens is we have a part of ourselves constantly berating, shaming, and judging another part of ourselves. And then even being willing to look at our own inner critic or our own shame or our own, and looking at that with curiosity and compassion, not as like, oh God, I can't believe I'm doing that. It's so stupid. Why am I doing that? I'm so embarrassed. That part of me is awful. I have to get rid of that part. That part's stupid. That part's not good enough. Again, it's that energy of shame or that energy of separation that shuts down the heart battery, rather than being curious and compassionate and maybe a little lighthearted, having a little humor about it. That's why I call our parts ridiculous or mischievous and call it eating shit sandwiches. I try to keep it a little bit lighter so that we don't get into, I sometimes can get into the intensity of it, and I get sort of like very serious about myself, and I start investigating my parts, and that there can be a time for that, but there can also be a time for, just being curious about them. They're like little children misbehaving. You don't look at your kids and be like, what, you peed on somebody in the sandbox and you want to eat ice cream for breakfast? You're terrible. You're disgusting. I need to get rid of you. No, you're like, okay, I'm going to agree that your behavior is suboptimal, but you're still worthy of love. And you don't want to be like, oh God, I can't even look at my kid. He's so embarrassing. He's bullying kids at school. I'm never talking to him again. Let's just pretend he doesn't exist. I know, no, my kid doesn't bully. You know what I mean? You want to look at that. You want to look at all those parts of you with vulnerability, with curiosity, with compassion. And even if some of those parts need mentoring. But again, that's why that self-compassion and that parts work is I find a very helpful foundation to partially create that inhospitable environment for shame, as well as, like we talked about in last week's episode, retrain our brain. We're literally training our brain to welcome self-awareness opportunities, to want to seek out our blind spots so that we're not shame collapsing and impacting other people, but not being brave enough to look at it.
Yeah. Maybe to re-emphasize for men listening the importance of heart and charging heart battery. Do you have any example of some clients that you have worked with about their experience of charging the heart battery and how it impacted their life?
Well, I have lots of different perspectives. I have lots of testimonials, but really a lot of men that I work with have checked a lot of the boxes. They've either been really high academic performers. They make millions of dollars. They're, at the top of their game. They might have a family. They might not have a family, but they still feel lonely, frustrated, misunderstood, and like something is missing, but they don't know what it is. Or they've been on a spiritual path for a lot of years. They do a lot of self-help. They've tried meditation, mindfulness, yoga, plant medicine, you name it, and they still feel like something is missing. So really, this vehicle of consciousness, going through each one of the systems and getting all of those different systems online, has really worked well for them. And that ability to connect with others and feel really energized and open and joyful and happy has been, life-changing for a lot of clients that I work with. And another part of that is looking at if they are working in a very harsh work environment. I have a client who's a homicide detective. I have a client who's in charge of like software developers in 8 countries and works in a very harsh, very masculine, very sort of like dog environment. And it can be very confusing for them to navigate opening this heart, getting the emotional navigation system online, and knowing, and I think, and then being in those environments that we've created in the old system where it's not really compatible to be sensitive and open and vulnerable. And again, I would propose that that's valid, and we need these evolutionary leaders. We need men to step into their power and reframe and remodel to other men what it means to look, what it means like to be a man, and what masculinity in the healed, divine, sacred masculine looks like. And that's going to require bravery, but also might just sometimes need discernment of when to let which part of you hold the talking stick, when to let the CEO hold the talking stick, when to let the vulnerable lover hold the talking stick, when to let the inner child hold the talking stick, and make sure, that we just have the ability to navigate when to let each part of us hold the talking stick at the boardroom or at the table of our consciousness. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's in a previous episode. All these parts kind of fit together over time. So yeah. And I mean, it can just mean the difference between when you love yourself, and not just love, but like, or experience and or appreciate and are curious and ever growing, not in like the coping mechanism, like I love myself, I'm perfect. That's actually a sign of, when people are in that arrogance, it's actually a sign of shame, right? It's one of those protector personalities creating a blind spot. But when you're in that true connection and you truly appreciate yourself, and you give yourself permission to fail, and you give yourself permission to be vulnerable, and you have the ability and the skills and the tools to have really juicy, exciting, fun, deep, soul connected, fulfilling relationships and friendships with yourself and others, I mean, you actually don't care as much about everything else, because you just feel amazing. You feel fulfilled. You feel whole. It doesn't mean you won't want the other things. I think we're an amazing species of abundance and we can have it all. But when you get those core needs met, everything else becomes easier. It's almost like, a lot of people might be familiar with the law of attraction. Like attracts like. Energy and trains to energy. We can see that with lots of classic science experiments. So it becomes easier. It's like synchronicities happen for you. When you're in that love, you're in that flow, you're connected to the World Wide Web, stuff is easier. You become magnetic when all these systems are working together. And when you are magnetic, it's like the right people come, the right opportunities come, you feel inspired, you feel energized, you're in flow state, you're inspiring to others, you're jumping timelines, you're quantumly, you're evolving, you are quantum leaping. And the things in your life just sort of reflect that back to you. You've got almost like those rose-colored glasses, and you've got, you are creating and experiencing and manifesting abundance and joy, and all of that becomes a reflection. Your perception of the external reality and what you attract in the external reality is a mirror of what is happening in your internal structure. So you go through all of these different episodes of this podcast and you look at all of these different parts, or you find different people to work with on these different parts. You now know what the different areas are you need to work on. You can work with others. You can work in one of my group programs or with me one-to-one and get all of these systems functioning. I mean, the world is your oyster. You never have to look back on your life and regret feeling like you've missed out, or struggling with relationships and feeling like you have to endure your life. You don't have to endure your life. And again, I've worked with people who have checked every box, check, check, check. Ivy League education, check. Millions of dollars, check. Maybe even in their 30s, check, 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 check. Checked all the boxes, but they don't feel happy. They don't feel fulfilled. And the heart battery is a very important part of that. So it might be uncomfortable. It might be unfamiliar. It might take some practice. It might take some failure, but the alternative is worse. So we can remember that.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add as we close off the heart as a battery or vehicle of consciousness?
Whoever's listening to this, you are worthy of love. You deserve to be loved. If you haven't experienced amazing relationships, it's not your fault. You haven't learned the tools. But it's time we evolve out of the emotional dark ages. And I celebrate you for being an evolutionary leader and being willing to lead humanity and lead the divine masculine in this massive up-leveling and creating a new paradigm and a new blueprint for how we can experience life when we're in this human vehicle of consciousness on this Earth school planet that we're currently experiencing. And I acknowledge that you maybe weren't set up for success. And I acknowledge that it might feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And I see you. And I just want you to know that you are worthy of love. You are capable of this. And thank you for being an evolutionary leader. Really, truly.
Yeah. And as always, if you have any questions, you can always, or feedback, we're always looking for improvements and covering topics that you might want to hear, or you want to get more clarity on something that might have been unclear. You can comment them. If you're watching on YouTube, you can comment them below. And there's always in show notes a link where you can submit your questions as well.
Yes. And there's also going to be a link where you can book a one-to-one strategy session with me where we map out your unique magnetic masculinity blueprint. And of course, maybe you'd be interested in a group program or having me create a corporate or company presentation, or one of the spots where I work VIP with men one-to-one to accelerate them. Instead of trying to crack the code, I accelerate you through this process so that you can very quickly learn the tools to experience for yourself the power of magnetic masculinity, or living your full life and your full potential. And yeah, that's always available to you as well. And I'd love to meet you and learn more about you.
And next week, we are revisiting emotions, and we're talking about navigation system. And here, it might be beneficial for anybody listening, if you haven't heard, to go back to the episode that we already referenced about the emotional objections, which was episode 12. It will also be in the show notes, a link so that you can go there. And yeah, so next episode we go into navigation system.
Yes, emotions, your navigation system, and your vehicle of consciousness. And we look forward to that. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.